Welcome back to the Piano Sonatas of Beethoven. This is Lecture 3. It is entitled The Grand Sonata, Part 1. That Beethoven did not have to waste his precious time early in his career composing in a style that would have had a wider appeal allowed him to experiment to a degree that few composers of his time ever enjoyed. We discussed this very briefly in Lecture 1, and now it's time to expand on that discussion. Professor Timothy Jones of the University of Exeter graces us with this explanation, and we quote, "It might be trivial, given his historical preeminence, to say that Beethoven stands out from his contemporaries, but it is worth stressing that his career as a pianist-composer was not typical. For most of the 1790s, his financial support was guaranteed by a small but powerful group of Viennese aristocratic sponsors, and this protected him from the mass market forces that weighed heavily upon his rivals. After tours to Berlin, Prague, and Pressburg in 1796, his sponsors relieved him of the need to make foreign journeys, and he was the only major keyboard player of his time never to set foot in Paris or London. Unlike pianists working in London, Beethoven rarely played in large public spaces. His performances were largely confined to Vienna's most elite aristocratic salons, where, since the death of Mozart in 1791, the select audiences had become increasingly receptive to high musical seriousness. Among his principal patrons, Baron Gottfried von Swieten and Prince Karl Lichnowsky had a taste for learned, serious music that was at odds with most widespread popular tastes. They encouraged Beethoven to pursue his already marked bent towards novel, difficult, and more densely argued music. Uniquely, the circles within which Beethoven worked were socially and artistically exclusive. Free from the need to be a popular composer, he could afford to largely eschew middle-browed mass market values in his performances and compositions." Unquote. Thank you, Professor Jones. From the very beginning, then, Beethoven was considered a pianist and a composer for the connoisseur, a musician's musician. Beethoven's patrons, who were fiercely protective of him, gave him tremendous space, both personally and artistically, to be himself, and therefore to develop on a path of his own making. Beethoven was like a 20th or 21st century composer who, as a member of academia, can experiment to his heart's delight, knowing full well that experimentation is expected as part of the gig. Now, obviously, not every composer wants to dwell in the ivory tower, above and beyond the popular currents of his or her time. And we'd hazard to suggest, my friends, that even fewer such composers should be allowed to cut themselves off from the world, and that they'd profit mightily by a little contact with real human beings and a little popular culture. But some composers will absolutely thrive in such an environment, and Beethoven was one of them. Sonata number 2 in A major, Opus 2, number 2, 1795. Like the Piano Sonata number 1 in F minor, the Sonata number 2 in A major is a 4-movement composition, which was a big deal in 1795. Piano sonatas to that point in time were almost always 3-movement works that followed a fast, slow, fast tempo scheme. The only genres of music in which you could reasonably expect to hear 4 movements were string quartets and symphonies, which also happened to be the most prestigious compositional genres of the classical era. Well, Beethoven's first 4 published piano sonatas are all 4 movements in length. They are grand sonatas, big works, genuinely orchestral in terms of expressive conception and complexity. Clearly, Beethoven was staking his claim to a new sort of piano music and making a powerful statement about the new importance of the piano as an instrument and the piano sonata as a genre. This lecture and the next are dedicated to understanding what makes these grand piano sonatas so very advanced for their time. Of the 3 Opus 2 piano sonatas, Number 2 in A major is the most graceful and playful of the set. A gentle interlude sandwiched between the Sturm und Drang, the storm and stress of the Sonata number 1 in F minor, and the massive and magnificent Sonata number 3 in C major. Piano Sonata in A major, movement 1, sonata form. Okay, theme 1 consists of 3 component phrases. The first phrase features a series of tippy-toe-like descending octaves and short descending runs, all of which are played in unison by the pianist's 2 hands, creating a light, almost comic effect. Please, let's hear this theme 1, phrase 1 from the first movement of the Piano Sonata number 2. Now, with the beginning of the second phrase of this opening theme, the theme abruptly and literally changes direction as a rising 16th note triplet blasts the melody upwards. This second phrase goes on to feature a series of imitative entries, which give the distinct impression of ever more melodic lines joining in, an effect that contrasts completely with the unison presentation of the first phrase. Please, from the very beginning of the movement, phrases 1 and 2. The third phrase of this theme brings together elements of both phrases 1 and 2, and it concludes with a closed cadence, the harmonic equivalent of a period. Again, from the beginning, theme 1 now in its entirety. The modulating bridge that follows begins with an imitative version of the rising 16th note triplet that initiated the second phrase of theme 1. This is brilliant, joyful music, though rather sooner than later the momentum flags and the harmonic palette darkens with the approach of theme 2. Before we talk about theme 2, though, let's hear the modulating bridge. What follows now is extraordinary, even revolutionary. Not only does Beethoven not begin the second theme in the correct key, but he proceeds to modulate through an entire series of key areas during the course of theme 2, only arriving in the proper key, in this case the key of E major, at the very end of this second theme. Now, my friends, a goodly portion of that last statement might very well have gone directly over the heads of many of us. We must, by absolute necessity, put the sonata in A major, Opus 2, number 2, on the back burner for a few minutes and talk about key, tonality, and the harmonic expectations of Beethoven's classical inheritance. Harmony. Oh dear. No single musical issue is more difficult to demonstrate to the untrained ear than that of key. Key refers to tonality, that is, the main pitch, the tonal center, or what's called the tonic in a given section of tonal music. Well, let's give it a go. The tonal harmonic system that allows our ears to identify individual tonal centers, individual keys, evolved during the Renaissance and the Baroque, roughly between 1400 and 1650. Beethoven used this tonal system the way we use the alphabet, as a basic building block of his musical language. At its essence, the tonal system is about complementary opposites, polar extremes that balance out each other. At the heart of the tonal system are two pitches and the harmonies or chords built on top of those pitches. In any given key, one of those pitches and harmonies will represent rest, and the other will represent tension in search of rest. If we say that we are in the key of C, it means that we perceive the pitch C as being the tonal center, as being the tonic pitch, and that we perceive the chord built atop the pitch C as the tonic chord. Let me play you a tonic chord. In the key of C, the pitch C and the chord built above it represent rest and repose. Of course, these words are entirely relative. They only have meaning relative to unrest and non-repose. Alpha is meaningless without omega. The so-called pitch and chord of tension, the polar opposite, the omega to the tonic's alpha, is the pitch and harmony that lies a perfect fifth, 5 white notes on the piano, above a given tonic note. In the key of C, that would be a G. In the key of C, the pitch G is called the dominant pitch. In the key of C, the chord built upon a G is called the dominant chord, or the chord of tension. By definition, a dominant chord is a dissonance, as it seeks repose by resolving to its tonal center, to its tonic, in this case, to a C chord. I will play the dominant chord followed by the tonic. And we should feel that sense of rest and resolution. Now look, we have neither the time nor I the inclination to explain in detail precisely why the tonal system is based on this perfect fifth, this series of upwards or downwards 5 notes. In this case, the distance upwards from a C to a G. Suffice it, please, for now, that the tonal system is a cultural expansion of a primal physical phenomenon. And that physical phenomenon is the power of the perfect fifth. If this sounds vaguely metaphysical, I do apologize, but like I said before, there's no easy way to talk about this stuff. Back then to the basic building blocks, the complementary opposites of the harmonic tonal system. The tonic chord, which represents rest, and the dominant chord, which represents tension. Now obviously, there's more to the tonal harmonic system than just rest and tension, although at its most basic level, that is indeed what it's all about. We can easily expand the length of that phrase, of that harmonic progression, by inserting other chords between the tonic and dominant chords. These are called sub or predominant chords. For example, let's first just take our tonic, dominant, tonic progression, and let's extend it. It can become if we chose to, we could expand that into and so forth. These progressions all represent departure and return, movement away from rest, towards tension, and finally back to rest. Having said that, the examples I just played all represent local departure and return, in that we were in the key of C the entire time. It's also possible, my friends, to effect a much larger scale departure and return, a departure not from just the chord that represents rest, the tonic C chord, but from the key of C entirely. This is a process called modulation, as in modulating bridge, where the harmony transits to an entirely new key area. For example, let's transit from the key of C to the key of A minor. Let's establish a new tonic. All right, a key question, if you'll excuse me. Should the listener expect to consciously follow the sorts of key changes that go on in a movement of tonal music? Well, of course not. That's like expecting a moviegoer to be consciously aware of every change of lens and angle and every edit that takes place during a film. As always, it's the cumulative effect we're interested in, and the cumulative effect of modulation during the course of a movement is one of large-scale departure and return, something we sense quite powerfully whether we're conscious of it or not. Modulation, large-scale harmonic departure and return, is the grease that lubricates the skids of tonal music. Without it, a piece of music would seem frozen and immobile. Properly used, a movement will soar through harmonic space, its propulsion supplied by a subtle and constant use of both local and large-scale harmonic departure and return, tension and release. All right, there's one more important harmonic topic we must tackle before we can get back to the A major sonata, and that's the topic of cadence. When a musical phrase ends on the tonic chord, we say that we have encountered a closed cadence. A cadence is a musical punctuation mark, and a closed cadence, with its palpable sense of resolution and rest, is the musical equivalent to a period in written language. Conversely, an open cadence is one that gets hung up on the dominant chord, the chord of tension. Like a comma in the middle of a sentence, an open cadence creates tension, tension that forces the music to continue in search of resolution. Tension! Resolution. We should also be aware that there is a type of cadence called a deceptive or false cadence, a type of cadence we'll define and discuss when we encounter it. Now, back when we were discussing the arrival of Theme 2 during the exposition of the first movement of the A major piano sonata, I said, and I quote myself, not only does Beethoven not begin the second theme in the correct key, but he proceeds to modulate through an entire series of key areas during the course of Theme 2, only arriving in the proper key at the very end of Theme 2. Okay, here's what that was all about. One of the essential aspects of sonata form is that in the exposition, Theme 2 will be heard in its own key, a key different from that of Theme 1, from that of the tonic. One of the essential expectations of sonata form is that if Theme 1 is in major, then Theme 2 will be in the major key of the dominant, that is, the key 5 notes above Theme 1. Meaning that, in the case of a movement that began in A major, like the one we're talking about right now, Theme 2 would be expected to be in the key of E major. It's just, my friends, one of those basic assumptions. It's a given, like Barry Bonds stepping up to the plate with a bat in his hand and not a feather duster. And if he should step up to the plate holding a feather duster, and perhaps wearing one of them cute little French maid outfits as well, it will be considered a revolutionary act, given the expectations and traditions of the game. Back then to Beethoven and his feather duster. Theme 2 begins in the key of E minor. As Theme 2 progresses, the bass line slowly rises over an octave as the harmony modulates through a series of different keys: E minor, G major, G minor, B flat major, D major, F sharp minor, and a partridge in a pear tree, before finally arriving in the expected key of E major at the very end of the theme. Please, let's hear it, this feather duster of a theme, Theme 2. No, that was not part of the development section. That was Theme 2. and we must hear it with the ears of Beethoven's contemporaries, who would have been absolutely shocked by such a passage. Of this second theme, the estimable Charles Rosen actually gets rather carried away when he writes, and we quote, "We cannot overestimate the revolutionary character of this passage, and a good deal of 19th and 20th century music springs from the exciting innovation of this rising bass and the final dissonant fortissimo violence," unquote. Please, let's hear the cadence material that begins with the same imitative 16th note music that initiated the modulating bridge through the closed cadence that concludes the exposition. Now, before we hear the exposition in its entirety, I would point out a little technical booby trap that Beethoven planted in Theme 2 to separate the pianistic women from the girls, as it were. At just the moment Theme 2 finally arrives in E major, finally, after all that modulation, Beethoven writes a couple of broken octave arpeggios, the first one falling, the second one rising, to celebrate that arrival. Now, these arpeggios are wonderful. They're spectacularly effective, brilliantly pianistic, and hellaciously difficult to play. Their presence here is the equivalent of a giant fickle finger, a finger that Beethoven has raised in the faces of all the amateur pianists who were the traditional consumers of piano sonatas there in Vienna. We hear the entire exposition. The development section and recapitulation are filled with all sorts of wonderful harmonic sleights of hand. From the very beginning of his compositional career, Beethoven's harmonic imagination was superb, and it betrays itself in the lightning-quick changes of mood and spirit we hear, particularly in his piano music, where shades of light and dark shift back and forth on the proverbial dime with a rapidity that leaves us just a little breathless. Movement 2, Rondo. The second movement, marked largo appassionato, meaning very slowly and passionately, is in rondo form. Rondo is a musical form in which the opening theme, the rondo theme, returns periodically like a refrain after various contrasting episodes. Even more important than the form of this second slow movement rondo is its mood and its spirit. Where the decorous slow movement of the Sonata No. 1 in F minor might be considered by one writer to be, quote, a relapse into a rococo affectation, unquote, the slow movement of this A major sonata is, according to Wilfrid Mellers, and again we quote, the first of those noble arias which, during Beethoven's middle and later years, are to embrace the heart of his humanistically religious experience, unquote. Despite the fact that the movement is in triple meter, a meter to which one can certainly dance, but certainly not march, the music does indeed have the feel of a solemn religious processional. The rondo theme itself features the sort of melodic motion and limited range we associate with plain chant and religious hymns, and the bass line has the steady gait of a processional or slow march. Let's hear the rondo theme of the second movement, Largo Appassionato, very slowly and passionately. Movement 3, Scherzo. In lieu of the expected designation of minuet and trio, Beethoven calls his third movement a scherzo. Truth be told, Beethoven never had much use for the sort of powder-wigged formality and snobbish aristocratic pretense and tradition that the minuet represented to him. Scherzo, which comes from the Italian verb scherzare, to joke, means literally, I'm joking. It's a designation Haydn used for the fast and playful minuet and trio movements in his Opus 33 string quartets of 1781. Well, Beethoven glommed onto Haydn's use of the word and made it his own. Like a minuet and trio, a Beethoven scherzo is typically a large-scale three-part movement, A, B, A, scherzo, trio, scherzo da capo. And like a minuet and trio, a Beethoven scherzo is typically in triple meter. However, Beethoven scherzi, which is the plural of scherzo, Beethoven scherzi are typically fast to very fast in tempo and bear no resemblance to the moderately paced minuet dances from which they evolved. Neither does Beethoven in his scherzi slavishly follow the phrase structure and ritual repetitions that are intrinsic to minuet and trio form. By calling his movements scherzi, Beethoven could do as he pleased without creating any of the expectations the title minuet would have evoked. Let's hear the opening scherzo section in its entirety. It's dominated by an arpeggio-like figure that Beethoven has indicated should be played leggero, smoothly. That tiny little musical idea, that motive, is the essential building block of the entire scherzo. It's typical of Beethoven's scherzi that they will seem virtually atomized, based as they are on the shortest, tightest musical ideas imaginable. Here it is, the opening scherzo, section A, from the A major sonata. We move forward to the fourth movement, also in rondo form. Program annotators just love to refer to this movement as perhaps the most Mozartian movement in all of the Beethoven piano sonatas. It's just the sort of throwaway line that can easily lead the listener astray. Yes, the movement displays a lightness and melodic grace that show us that Beethoven, not yet 25 years old, has mastered the classical style to a degree matched only by Joseph Haydn and Wolf Mozart. But in its details, the nature of its themes, the harmonic invention, the degree of contrast between sections, the constant and mercurial shifts of mood, the use of the piano, and the length of the coda, it's the details, my friends, that mark this music as being uniquely Beethoven's. The rondo theme, theme A as it were, begins with a sort of signature motive, a rapid rising arpeggio that spans 3.5 octaves. This rising gesture is a version of the 16th note triplet that blasted the second part of theme 1, movement 1, upwards. Here, it not so much blasts as nudges, and it nudges an otherwise rather shy and restrained theme into action. Let's hear it, the fourth movement rondo theme, beginning with the upwards nudging arpeggio. The first contrasting episode, section B, if we are to schematicize the movement, the rondo theme having been section A, begins with a transitional passage in running 16th notes and then introduces a theme of its very own. Theme B, for want of a better name, in the new key of E major. Let's hear this first contrasting episode. The rondo theme now returns, although please notice the rising arpeggio has been widened from 3.5 octaves to 4.5 octaves, pretty much the entire length of Beethoven's 5-octave keyboard, and the theme is now in its second permutation, embellished. The second contrasting episode that follows this version of the rondo theme, we'll call it section C, is in A minor. It's aggressive and militant in tone and features staccato scales and punchy chords that, had this been orchestral music, would have almost certainly been played by horns and trumpets. Let's hear the first restatement of the rondo theme, what we might call A prime, followed by the second contrasting episode, C. Oh, can't we just taste the rondo theme? And yes, this is a marvelous textbook example of a rondo in that we can hear the clear differentiation between the gentle rondo theme, gentle in this movement, as a refrain, alternating with these extremely different contrasting sections. All right, the rising arpeggio that introduces the next restatement of the rondo theme has now been expanded into a 4.5 octave scale, one that consists of 32 notes and takes an entire measure to perform. Let's hear this third appearance of the rondo theme, followed by a reprise of section B and theme B, now heard in the home key of A major. The coda now follows. Now, the job of a coda is to create a convincing sense of conclusion. At least that's how the classical era defined the coda. As we might assume from that definition, classical era codas were generally short and to the point. Reinforce the final closed cadence, maybe bring back a phrase or two of the principal theme of the movement, and then stop, my friends, stop. Well, codas for Beethoven were not generally short and to the point. Like the guest who refuses to get up and go home, Beethoven's codas can go on and on and on. Although, unlike that unwelcome guest, we're always happy to have Beethoven with us for an extra minute or two. Now, the coda here in the fourth movement rondo of the A major piano sonata takes up a full quarter of the movement and is, for all intents and purposes, a development section. A development section at the end of a rondo? Can Beethoven do that? Hey, Big Dog does what Big Dog wants to do. Besides, this is exactly what I was referring to at the end of the last lecture regarding Beethoven investing his final movements with ever greater expressive and intellectual weight. What this lengthy coda does, in fact, do is integrate the three essential thematic elements of the movement: the rondo theme, what we've called A, theme B, and the minor material of section C, thematic elements that had, up to this point of the movement, all been presented separately. It's a fabulous section of music, and it demonstrates that here, even early in his career, Beethoven will use the classical era forms, in this case rondo, only up to the point where they serve his expressive needs. After that, my friends, he'll simply go his own way, do what he wants to do, because for Beethoven, expressive need, that is, dramatic context, always trumps tradition and ritual. Always. Let's hear the coda, which begins with yet another version of the rondo theme. Piano Sonata in C major, Opus 2, number 3. Now, my friends, despite the fact that we have only a little more than a minute remaining in this lecture, I want us to jump in and begin discussing the Piano Sonata in C major, Opus 2, number 3, so that when Lecture 4 begins, we'll be able to hit the ground running. The C major, the third and final sonata of the Opus 2 set, is the grandest, most virtuosic, most orchestrally conceived sonata of not just Beethoven's Opus 2, but the grandest, most virtuosic, most orchestrally conceived piano sonata ever composed to its time. It's a bold, four-movement work that runs in total over 25 pianoforte bashing minutes in length. Pianist Kenneth Drake addresses this orchestral issue in Opus 2, number 3, when he writes, and we quote, The virtuoso in one's nature finds in the C major sonata a brilliant professional sonata, a brawny piece in which we pretend that the piano, played by 10 fingers, is equal to an orchestra of 60 or 70 players. The C major sonata is a bona fide original composition for the piano, but it is also a transcription of an orchestral ideal that must be retranscribed by one's imagination when playing it, unquote. When we return, the in all ways orchestrally conceived Piano Sonata in C major, Opus 2 No. 3 of 1795, a virtual concerto for solo piano. Thank you.